Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm so excited to kick things off with some of the wildest and most unhinged Reddit stories you'll ever hear. Whether you're studying, chilling, or just looking for something to keep you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. Thank you for checking out my channel. Your support truly means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Alright, let's jump right in and see what kind of chaos Reddit has in store for us today. My roommate keeps texting me, but she's already home. I've always believed in the idea of destined paths, that some people circle each other's orbits until finally, inevitably, they meet in a way that changes everything. That's precisely how I used to feel about Ellen. She and I have known each other practically our entire lives, having grown up in the same small suburban neighborhood. We rode bikes on the same streets, hiked the same local trails, and even attended the same elementary, middle, and high schools. Yet, despite these overlapping experiences, we never formally dated until after college. It was as if life kept nudging us closer, but the timing wasn't right. I remember the day I finally asked her out. We were both in our early 20s back in our hometown one summer, wandering aimlessly through the local flea market. She wore that bright yellow sundress that always brought out the light in her eyes. She smiled up at me in a way that made my heart take an extra beat. I confessed I'd been meaning to ask her out for a while. Ellen laughed, warm and genuine, and said she was wondering when I'd muster the courage. From that moment on, it felt as if we'd found the place we were always meant to be, side by side. 3 years ago, we decided to move in together. She found a cozy apartment near the outskirts of town, not far from the nature preserves we loved. The place wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, a sliver of a backyard, and a living room that opened into a small kitchen. But it was ours, and it felt so right to share it. For the first 2 years, everything was brilliant. We had the same sense of humor, the same Netflix queue, even the same weakness for late-night pizza. We'd watch horror movies, ironically enough, laughing at the jump scares. She'd bury her face in my shoulder if things got too tense. I'd tease her that a strong-willed person like herself had nothing to fear. She'd swat at me, insisting it was just a reflex. My teasing would usually end with both of us giggling on the couch. Life seemed good, almost too good. Yet, if there was any real darkness in Ellen's life, it rested in her family background. She had no siblings, something that made me appreciate my own large family all the more. Her father died young, and from everything Ellen told me, he was cruel when alive. Her mother, who had been a second mother to me, passed away last year after a battle with illness. Ellen grieved deeply, but in a private way. She was never the type to openly sob or talk for hours about her pain. Instead, she'd smile and assure me that she was fine. I tried to coax her out of her shell, but the best support I could give was simply being there. So when she withdrew a little, I assumed it was part of the process. I never imagined anything more sinister. That's why everything that happened over the last few nights feels impossible, terrifying, surreal even. It began so subtly that if I hadn't been restless, I might have dismissed the entire thing as a dream. It's strange, the details that stick with you in a moment of semi-consciousness. I remember the green glow of my digital clock, 3:27 a.m., and how a wave of frustration rippled through me at the thought of having to be up for work in just a few hours. My dream had been pleasant, though I can't recall what it was about anymore. All of that was shattered by the sensation of a soft, slow caress on my hair. I opened my eyes groggily and found Ellen sitting upright next to me. She wore an unreadable expression, her eyes wide in the dimness. In a gentle voice, she said, "Knock, knock, knock, knock." I blinked, trying to shake off the sedation of sleep. "Ellen, I mumbled. What's going on?" She repeated it, her voice low and insistent. "Knock, knock, knock, knock." At first, I thought maybe she had an odd late-night joke or wanted my attention for something. She'd never done anything like that before, but I was too tired to question it thoroughly. "Okay, fine," I said. "Who's there?" Ellen's mouth curved into the tiniest smile. "Not me," she whispered. "So don't answer the door." She said it as if it were the punchline to a riddle I should know. Sleepily, I let out a confused laugh. "That's it? That's your joke?" She nodded, slid off the bed, picked up a spare blanket, and lay down on the small love seat in our bedroom. "Thank you for answering," she said. Her eyes fluttered shut. I was too groggy to question it. I fell back asleep. The next morning, when we woke up, Ellen was cheerful, reading the morning headlines on her phone, sipping coffee. I was the one who felt uneasy. I pressed her. "So, last night? You woke me up." She looked genuinely puzzled. "Did I? I don't remember that. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Her confusion could have been genuine. Maybe she slept through the entire event. Ellen used to joke that she was half lucid in the middle of the night. Still, the memory felt too real for me to brush it aside. When it happened again the following night, my confusion turned to dread. This time, I recall the entire day leading up to it. Work was exhausting, and I was looking forward to unwinding. Ellen and I had dinner, chatted about our days, and everything felt normal. She teased me about not doing the dishes. I teased her about leaving her hair ties everywhere. We fell asleep in each other's arms around 11 p.m. Then, the same moment, I snapped awake to the clock's unwavering glow, 3:27 a.m. My skin prickled with a sense of foreboding. Sure enough, Ellen was upright again, though not touching me. She was simply perched on the bed, hands folded in her lap, leaning slightly over me, watching. "Knock, knock," she whispered, her voice that same breathy hush. My heart thumped. "Ellen, come on, I have work in the morning," I groaned. She tilted her head. "Knock, knock, knock." I tried ignoring it. I turned onto my side, burying my face in the pillow. But she persisted, chanting those two words, "Knock, knock, knock, knock." There was a softness to her voice, but it felt unnatural. When I finally relented and said, "Fine, who's there?" she repeated that strange phrase, "Not me, so don't answer the door." A chill slid up my spine. She delivered those words in an utterly monotone voice, at odds with the faint smile on her lips. Something about it made every hair on my arms stand on end. And like clockwork, once I gave in, she lay down again, as if that were enough. Her eyes closed, and within minutes I heard her deep, steady breathing. She fell asleep, or at least pretended to. For nearly an hour I lay awake, adrenaline coursing, uncertain what to make of this. Was Ellen sleep-talking? Why this repeated phrase? When morning came, I tackled the topic again, more insistent this time. I expected her to laugh, or maybe apologize for playing a prank. Instead, she grew evasive. She glanced away and claimed she didn't remember. When I pressed, Ellen's voice sharpened defensively. She changed the subject, focusing on random tasks, groceries, bills, her job. This was so unlike her. Ellen was typically open. We talked about everything from our childhood traumas to silly memes we found online. Now, it felt like she was hiding a secret she refused to share. Yet I couldn't push too hard without feeling guilty. She'd been through so much with losing her mother. Maybe stress was manifesting in bizarre ways. Regardless, I resolved to keep watch that night, hoping to catch her in the act and figure out if she was merely sleep-talking. The day passed in uneasy anticipation. I barely slept, I drifted off a few times, only to jolt awake. Each time, I stared at the bright digits of the clock. 1 a.m., 2:15 a.m., 2:50 a.m. Just before 3:27 a.m., my eyes fluttered, and I felt that slip into dreamlessness. Then, in the darkness, I heard it. Knock, knock. She was at it again, a surreal, broken record. My heart pounded because this time, her voice was colder. Instead of that faint smile, her face looked blank, her eyes half-lidded, as though she barely blinked. "Ellen," I hissed, "what are you doing?" Knock, knock. I tried a new tactic. Silence. I refused to engage. If it was some ritual that required me to answer, maybe not answering would break the cycle. So I lay there, controlling my breathing, pretending not to hear. But she persisted. Over and over she repeated it, her voice never wavering in pitch. 15 times, 20? I lost count. My heart hammered so loudly in my chest I wondered if she could hear it. Finally, I snapped. "God damn it, Ellen," I shouted, sitting up, the bed covers tangling around my legs. "Stop doing this. This is insane." She didn't even flinch. She just turned to me with that eerie, unblinking expression. Her mouth was open a fraction, lips parted in a fixed shape, as if she were locked in mid-word. A whisper escaped her. Knock, knock. This time, her eyes were different. The pupils were huge, swallowing the iris, and there was something unrecognizable in that gaze. My skin crawled. "Fine," I said, almost a growl. "Who's there?" She breathed in slowly, as if relieved. "Not me," she whispered. "Don't answer the door." A wave of coldness rippled through me. My limbs felt weak. My mouth was dry. "Ellen," I managed. "I don't know what any of that means. Just, please stop." She said nothing else. Gradually, her eyes slid shut and she sank back onto the mattress. In moments, she was asleep. But I wasn't convinced. I lay there, rigid, for another hour. I couldn't close my eyes, certain that if I did, I'd awaken to her hovering over me again. By morning, Ellen was once again herself. She asked why I looked so exhausted. I demanded we talk. She stared at the floor, fidgeting. Her voice trembled as she insisted she had no memory of these nighttime antics. Yet a flicker in her eyes told me she was scared. Of what? I didn't know. I was desperate enough to phone a college friend of mine, a psychologist, in the middle of my lunch break at work. I recounted Ellen's nightly ritual in as much detail as possible. She listened intently, then cautiously suggested that maybe Ellen's stress was manifesting as some parasomnia, sleep-talking, mild sleepwalking, or even a stress-induced repeated phrase. I asked if it was normal for her to stare so directly, eyes open like that. My friend admitted it wasn't common, but not impossible. She recommended making an appointment. It was the best advice I'd heard in days. I told Ellen about it. She grew quiet but eventually nodded in agreement. She apologized for scaring me and said she'd go to see my friend if it would help put our minds at ease. That night, we had a nice dinner. Ellen even tried cooking my favorite dish, shrimp scampi, though it came out a bit too salty. We laughed about it. For a moment, it felt like the old us. That sense of closeness I'd feared losing was back. We settled in bed, watching an old sitcom, her hand entwined with mine. I drifted off, silently praying that it would be a normal night. It was not. At precisely 3:27 a.m., the cycle repeated. But tonight, it escalated in a way that left me chilled to the bone. The first thing I noticed was the hush. Our neighborhood is typically quiet, but this silence felt oppressive, like every ambient noise had been sucked out of the air. Then came the sensation of something, or someone, leaning over me. I opened my eyes and saw only shadow. I whispered, "Ellen?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, out of the darkness, her voice cut through. Knock, knock. Terror rooted me in place. I tried to move, but a wave of disorientation made my limbs feel heavy. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking. She stood there, next to my side of the bed, just a few inches from my face, hair hanging limp around her shoulders like a curtain. Knock, knock, she repeated, so quietly it was almost a whimper. My pulse hammered. "Who's there?" I whispered, voice quivering. The corners of her mouth inched upward. "Not me," she said, her tone as flat as ever. "Don't answer the door." I was about to plead with her to stop when she abruptly stiffened, her mouth closing. Her head tilted toward the bedroom doorway, as if she were listening for something. Then I heard it too, faint footsteps. No, more like a soft scraping from somewhere in the house. I sat up, adrenaline surging. "What was that?" I hissed. Ellen said nothing. She moved away from me with unnatural slowness, eyes fixated on the open bedroom door. My own heart hammered so loudly that for a second I thought I might pass out. The scraping sound came again, this time from the direction of the living room. A subtle scratch, scratch, scratch against wood, like nails dragging along the floor or the wall. Ellen stood motionless, arms slack at her sides. I forced my shaking legs out of bed, noticing I still wore yesterday's clothes. Stumbling to the doorway, I flipped on the light switch. Dim overhead lighting flooded the corridor. "Ellen," I called, though I barely recognized my own trembling voice. She said nothing, only glided forward, deeper into the gloom of the house. I followed, trying not to make noise. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. The living room was dark except for the faint glow of a small kitchen nightlight. Ellen drifted to the center of the room, staring at the front door. I became excruciatingly aware of that phrase. Not me. "Don't answer the door." Then came the knocking, soft at first, then louder. The doorknob jiggled, metal scraping. My throat went dry. A voice spoke from the other side, muffled yet eerily clear. It said, "John. John, can you hear me? Open up. It's me, Ellen." A wave of raw horror surged through me. I whipped around, staring at the thing, in front of me. She wore Ellen's pajamas, but her face bore that twisted half-smile. I couldn't make sense of it. Was the real Ellen outside? Or was the real one in here? The voice called again, desperation seeping through every syllable. "John, please open up. You have to trust me. She's not me." The woman inside the house remained motionless, except for her lips curling wider, revealing clenched teeth. It was a ghastly attempt at a smile, too large for her face. Everything about it made my skin crawl. I stood there, frozen between two Ellens. One outside, pleading for me to open the door, another inside, silent and unblinking, emanating menace. My legs felt weak. The doorknob rattled more violently. I had no idea who to believe. The indoor Ellen took one step toward me, and her hand closed around my wrist with an icy grip. I wanted to scream, but the air lodged in my throat. The last thing I remember is my vision swimming, darkness creeping into the edges of my sight until I blacked out. When I came to, I was back in bed, alone. The digital clock read 4:21 a.m. My body shook uncontrollably, clothes sticking to my damp skin. I called Ellen's name, but there was no reply. The house was eerily quiet. I searched the room for my phone, thinking to call the police, but it was nowhere. My only option was Ellen's laptop in the spare bedroom. That's where I am now, typing this account. The faint gray light outside suggests dawn is close, yet every shadow in the house feels threatening. The front door is locked. Ellen is gone, and I have no idea what happened after I lost consciousness. Was the real Ellen outside the whole time, or was that another trick? Which one was telling the truth? My nerves are shot. I keep hearing intermittent scratching somewhere under the floor or in the walls, and every time it happens, my heart seizes. I don't know if I can wait for my friend's appointment next week. I don't even know if this is something a psychologist can fix. Part of me wants to run out the door and never come back. Another part clings to the hope that this is a nightmare I'll wake up from. But my heart knows it's all too real. The only thing I'm sure of is that something happened to Ellen. My Ellen. And these 4 nights have turned my life into a warped reflection of everything I used to cherish. I'm stuck between 2 possibilities. She's either deeply disturbed and has no memory of tormenting me, or something else is imitating her, playing a twisted game. I can't decide which is worse. If you're reading this, understand that I didn't abandon her easily. She was my world, and if there's a chance to save her, I'll try. But right now, I can't even tell what's real anymore. I just know I'm afraid to open any door. The corridor's dark, almost as if the shadows have weight. Something is scratching beneath my feet. What should I do? I've asked myself this question repeatedly. Every logical part of me says to get out, to go somewhere safe and regroup. But love keeps me tethered here. If there's any chance she's trapped somewhere calling out to me, I can't leave. I can't bear the thought of leaving her behind. Yet, as I sit here, typing, I sense movement in the hallway again. The doorknob to this spare room rattles softly, almost too softly to hear. It's 4:48 a.m. The sun will rise soon, but I'm not certain that daylight will banish whatever's lurking in these walls. All I can do is keep writing, keep documenting. If I disappear, let this be my testimony. Ellen was gone when I woke. The house is dark. A voice that sounds just like her called to me from outside. Another that looks just like her is in here somewhere, or maybe nothing is here at all, and I'm slowly losing my grip on reality. But I swear this is real. The knock-knock joke. The 3:27 a.m. wake-ups. The whispered warning. Not me. Don't answer the door. It's more than just a string of coincidences or nightmares. I won't open the door again, not if I hear someone knocking. I don't know if I can trust any voice. For now, my plan is to survive until morning. Then I'll leave, somehow, and search for help. If Ellen is out there, if she's truly in danger, I pray I find her. But I can't stay in this silent, suffocating apartment a moment longer than necessary. I can still hear the faint scratching sound below. It's growing louder, more insistent, as if something is clawing its way up. I'm running out of time. I have to end this. I have to decide whether to open that bedroom door or push a chair against it and hope the sun's arrival drives away whatever evil lingers. If I don't make it, maybe someone else will. Maybe you, reading this. Take warning. Never ignore the small, odd moments your loved ones exhibit in the middle of the night. Sometimes, behind the familiar face of someone you cherish, there might be something else entirely. And if you ever hear, at 3:27 a.m., a voice whisper, "Knock, knock, knock, knock," do yourself a favor and don't answer. Trust me, there's nothing you want behind that door. The 5-second rule was never about spilled food. I still remember the first time I stepped foot into that cellar as a child. Maybe I was 7 or 8 years old, and the thick, musty air pressed in around me. At that age, I was short enough that the ceiling rafters seemed overwhelmingly high, and the dark corners felt like they reached on forever. My father had handed me a small flashlight, an old metal one that flickered when you shook it. My only job was to hold it steady so he could fetch a jar of tomato sauce from the back shelf. But I couldn't keep my hands from trembling. Even then, I sensed there was something unsettling about being below ground, enveloped in a hush unlike anywhere else in the house. My parents never told us outright that the cellar was dangerous. They didn't have to. They had a rule. Remember the 5-second rule. Every single time we went down there, one or both of them would say it, as if it were the only instruction that mattered. Back then, my brother and I assumed it was just another silly grown-up rule, like no cookies before dinner, or wash your hands after playing outside. But there was something in their voices when they reminded us, just the slightest tremor, that made us take it more seriously. Even as kids, we could feel it wasn't a joke. The rule itself was simple enough. Upon entering the cellar, we were supposed to turn on the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. No big deal, just yank the cord, wait for it to glow. Then, when we left, we had to turn that light off and hurry up the wooden steps within 5 seconds. It never seemed like an onerous requirement. Our parents never gave us a reason, and we didn't ask. The brevity of the countdown actually turned leaving the cellar into a game. My brother or I would yank the light chain, shout, "Go!" Then we'd scramble up the steps, tripping over each other's ankles, hearts pounding. Once we were out, we'd laugh, breathless and relieved, hearts hammering with the adrenaline of that quick climb. But at least we were safe in the bright hallway near the kitchen. Over the years, my family treated that 5-second rule like a quirk of the house. As my brother and I got older, teens, then into our early 20s, we stopped giving it much thought. Honestly, we hardly went down into the cellar anymore. That space was mostly for long-term food storage, leftover holiday decorations, and musty boxes that no one cared to sort. By the time we were both off to college, the cellar had become an afterthought. Something our parents used occasionally, but never brought up in conversation. Then my parents got older. Small tasks around the house became more difficult for them. Lugging the laundry basket, scrubbing the floors, changing light bulbs. My father developed a limp, and my mother's arthritis worsened, especially in her knees. The rickety old house suddenly became an obstacle course. Stairs, narrow hallways, worn-out floors that could trip you if you didn't watch your step. Eventually, they called my brother and me with an announcement. They'd decided to sell the house and move somewhere more accessible, perhaps a single-level place in a quieter community. My brother and I felt a wave of sadness. This old farmhouse was our childhood home, the site of countless birthday parties and Christmas gatherings. But we also knew it was for the best. And so, before the sale went through, my parents organized one final family dinner in that house, just the 4 of us. My brother bought a plane ticket back home. I drove in from 2 states away. We converged on that quiet street lined with tall oak trees and parked on the same gravel driveway we used to run across with bare feet when we were kids. Even the crunch of the stones under my sneakers awakened memories. Me, age 9, scuffing my knees. My brother, arms pumped, outrunning me to the porch. Walking through the front door, I was struck by how little had changed. There was that subtle smell, Mom's cooking, old wood, a hint of cleaning solution. My dad's sweater hung on the coat rack. My mom's reading glasses were on the side table in the hallway. The rooms seemed smaller, though. I don't know if it was just the nostalgia messing with my perception, or the fact that I'd lived in different, more modern spaces for so long. My mom greeted me with the same warm smile as always, and my dad gave me a hug that felt both comforting and fragile at once. We spent the next hour or so catching up. My brother was sprawled on the couch, scratching our family cat's chin, while I helped my mother in the kitchen. She moved slowly, but insisted on preparing most of the meal herself. She only needed me to gather some canned chicken broth from the cellar to complete the soup she was making. Of course, the moment I approached the cellar door, she repeated the line that had been etched into my mind for decades. Don't forget the 5-second rule. I felt a jolt of nostalgia. Hearing it at my age, late 20s, was oddly comforting. It also stirred up all the old questions I'd never dared to ask, but I just smiled and nodded. Yes, Mom. The cellar door groaned when I opened it, its hinges stiff from disuse. The stairs descended into near blackness. There was only a hint of light coming from behind me. Hand on the railing, I took careful steps down, feeling that familiar sense of unease as my shoes touched the cold concrete floor. I located the chain in the center of the ceiling and pulled. The light bulb flickered to life, illuminating rows of shelves stuffed with dusty jars and cans, plus a disorganized stack of old cardboard boxes in one corner. Nothing had changed. Same gloom, same faint dampness in the air. I walked past some shelving, scanning for the familiar green-labeled broth cans. Sure enough, there was a crate of them on the bottom shelf. I squatted down, took hold of one, and as I reached for a second, I heard a noise. It was a small, scuffling sound, like something brushing against cardboard or a plastic bag. I froze. We'd had mice infestations in the past, and this place was a prime nesting ground. Hoping it was just a rodent, I stood up slowly, scanning the basement with the overhead light's weak glow. The sound stopped. Even so, I felt that small prickle of anxiety at the base of my spine. To shake it off, I placed the 2 cans of broth under my arm and decided not to linger. If it was just a mouse, who cared? Let Mom and Dad deal with it later, or the future owners. I had no desire to hunt it down. I slid my foot carefully between a few dusty boxes so I could stand fully, then pivoted back toward the stairs. That's when the light bulb above my head flickered. Once, twice, then it snuffed out completely, plunging me into darkness so thick I couldn't see my own hand. It happened so fast that for a second my mind couldn't register it. All I knew was that the floor felt too uneven, and the air too still. I heard the faintest shuffle behind me. It wasn't a mouse or a rat. This was heavier. A presence, maybe a footstep. My heart stuttered. In the gloom, I instinctively fumbled for the chain overhead, but my arms knocked into the edge of a shelf. Metal cans rattled precariously before toppling. One clanged near my foot and rolled out of reach. I managed to grab hold of the chain and pulled repeatedly, but the light didn't come on. It felt as if the chain wasn't connected anymore, or maybe the bulb had burned out. That sense of childhood dread returned full force. Suddenly, the 5-second rule flared up in my mind. 5 seconds to get out after the light goes out. But I was disoriented, off balance, and I didn't know how many seconds had already passed. 5? 10? Gritting my teeth, I took a shaky breath and began counting. 5, I murmured to myself, trying to gather courage. I placed the broth cans on the floor, no longer worried about them. My focus was on the stairs. I had to get there, fast. 4. I took a step forward. Something tugged on my shirt sleeve. At first, I thought it snagged on a protruding edge from a crate, but this felt too deliberate, like fingers. My breath caught in my throat. I yanked my arm away with a burst of panic, and I heard the distinct sound of someone stepping backward, as if startled. Then, almost immediately, I heard a voice. A raspy exhalation, a whispered word, I couldn't be sure, but it gave me chills. 3, I gasped, ignoring the stinging in my wrist. I took another step, feeling the rough concrete beneath my shoe, trying not to slip. The darkness was so complete I couldn't even see the shape of the stairs. My outstretched hand slapped a tall cardboard box. My nerves were on high alert, every hair on my body standing upright. 2, I muttered, scurrying sideways. I bumped into something metallic, an old shelf, and it screeched as it scraped the floor. Then, as if on a timer, the light bulb flickered back to life for a split second. Blinded by the sudden brightness, I glimpsed a shape in the corner. It was low, near the ground, behind the boxes. I couldn't make out any details, only that it was definitely bigger than a rat or mouse. Then the light vanished again, plunging me back into darkness. Maybe I screamed, I'm not sure. All I knew was that fear shot through me like a jolt of electricity. "One," I whispered, summoning my last shred of resolve. I rushed forward, nearly slamming my shin against the bottom step. My fingers found the wooden railing. My legs strained as I took the steps 2 at a time. For a terrifying half-second, I felt resistance behind me, as if someone, something, had latched onto my pant leg. But I twisted free, practically throwing myself upward. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached the landing. The moment I stumbled into the hallway, I slammed the cellar door shut and threw the bolt. My entire body shook. My brother, who was on the couch, craned his neck to see what the commotion was. I could barely form words. Mom appeared from the kitchen, her brow furrowed with concern. "What happened? Are you okay?" I tried to answer, but my tongue felt numb. I stole a glance at my brother. He was wide-eyed, probably more shocked by my pale face than by the noise. Eventually, I managed. "Light went out. I heard something." Mom's frown deepened, but she didn't press for details. She put a hand on my shoulder in a comforting gesture, but I felt tension in her grip, as if she already knew something ominous was down there. My brother, apparently wanting to show off his bravery, started laughing. "Let me guess, you got spooked by a shadow?" I could see he was trying to lighten the mood, but his forced grin told me he wasn't convinced everything was fine either. Dinner carried on in a strange haze after that. My dad tried to keep conversation normal, asking about my job, my brother's classes, and so on, but I found myself distracted, replaying every second of my experience in the cellar. Each time I recalled that tug on my sleeve, a shiver rippled up my spine. And what about the shape I'd glimpsed in the flicker of light? No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it out of my thoughts. Part of me still clung to the rational explanation that maybe my brother had followed me down, messed with the light, and tried to scare me. He'd definitely done pranks in the past. But something told me it was more than that. I'd felt genuine fear, as though confronted with an unfamiliar presence. After dinner, we all gathered in front of the house for a final family photo. The act was bittersweet, one last memento of our time there. As we stood on the porch, my dad brought out a tripod, carefully propped it up, and set the camera's timer. My mom stood between my brother and me, each of us forcing a smile while the old house loomed behind us. The camera's flash momentarily stole my vision, and in that bright moment I wondered about what lurked in the basement. When my eyes readjusted, I half expected to see a silhouette at one of the windows. There was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Once we said our farewells, my brother left for the airport, and I planned to drive straight back to my place. My parents insisted they'd be fine staying in the house until the sale concluded. I felt a pang of worry for them, but they were adamant that they knew the place better than anyone, and they'd handle the final packing up. Meanwhile, I was more than ready to put that night behind me. I climbed into my car, turned on the engine, and tried to focus on the upcoming road trip. Yet, as I looked in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the old cellar window. A flicker of movement disappeared almost before I registered it. I almost went back, told them to come with me, or at least check the cellar again. But a deep sense of unease, that same dread that had been building, kept me glued to the driver's seat. Besides, what proof did I have? All I'd be doing was scaring them and unveiling half-formed theories. So I drove off into the night, headlights guiding me through the familiar roads that twisted away from my childhood home. It's been quite some time now, and still, I have no definitive explanation. All I have are memories. The unwavering seriousness of my parents' voices, the dark shape crouched among the boxes, the relentless feeling that I wasn't alone in that cellar when the bulb flickered. Sometimes I think about how swiftly that presence tugged at my sleeve, how it seemed to hesitate when I yanked away, and that second of bright light revealing something that shouldn't have been there is forever etched into my mind. Looking back, I wish I'd asked more questions. I wish I'd probed the origin of the rule that governed our childhood so forcefully. 5 seconds was such a short interval, but sometimes it feels like a lifetime, that fleeting period I had to escape. Maybe it was just a superstition that my parents picked up along the way, feeding on the natural spookiness of a place seldom visited. Or maybe it was a precaution they once learned the hard way, an encounter with something they'd rather forget. When I dream about it, I'm back in that cellar, the overhead light flickering, my breath catching as I count down. 5, 4. The shapes around me close in. 3, 2. The chain dangles uselessly from the ceiling. Then I feel a hand grasp my shoulder, and the dream dissolves into chaos. Each time, I wake up in my own bed, older now, safe yet trembling. Because some part of me knows. Illusions or not, something was down there. Something that makes the house's old 5-second rule a little too real. I haven't had the courage to find out what happened with that cellar since new owners took over. If they kept it locked, or if they ever changed the single light bulb, or if they rummaged around in those piles of dusty boxes. If they did, maybe they experienced nothing strange at all. Or maybe they have their own set of rules now. All I know is that when I think of that final dinner, my parents smiling, my brother laughing, and the house standing quietly behind us, I can't stop imagining the darkness below ground, waiting for someone else to step inside. And I think of the voice that might whisper to them, urging them to hurry up the steps as they flick the light bulb off. Hurry, you have 5 seconds. Don't ask why, just go. My son says, there's a man in his closet. I've always prided myself on being a practical, level-headed parent. I'd laugh off my son's wild imaginings as the natural byproduct of an overactive mind. Ben, my 4-year-old with an uncanny sense of observation, had always been a little imaginative, a bit prone to the theatrics of childhood fear. I told myself that his insistence on monsters was nothing more than fantasy. I never imagined that one night his whispers would make me question everything I thought I knew about protecting him. It started on an otherwise ordinary night. After a long day of play at the park and a dinner filled with laughter and the clatter of his favorite cereal, I tucked Ben into bed. His small room was painted a soft blue, adorned with cartoon characters and a few handmade drawings that he'd proudly left on his nightstand. I flipped off the overhead light and switched on the small nightlight shaped like a moon. The gentle glow bathed the room in calm, reassuring light. "Good night, buddy," I murmured, smoothing his tousled hair and planting a kiss on his forehead. His eyes fluttered closed almost immediately, and I left the room with a smile, convinced that he'd soon be lost in sweet dreams. But about an hour later, I was jolted awake by a soft, trembling voice calling my name. Groggy and disoriented, I blinked at the darkness of the hallway before hearing it again. This time, clearer and more insistent. "Mom, Mom, please wake up." I rushed back to Ben's room, heart pounding in confusion. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room where the moon-shaped nightlight cast only a feeble glow. There, on the edge of his bed, Ben was sitting up, his eyes wide and glistening with tears. His small hand clutched my arm tightly, and in a trembling whisper he said, "The man in the closet is watching again." I froze, the words echoing in the quiet room. "What do you mean, baby?" I asked softly, trying to hide my alarm with a smile that I hoped would be reassuring. Ben's gaze was fixed on the closet door. I followed his look and saw that it was not fully closed. It hung ajar, as if someone had gently pulled it open. "He doesn't like you, Mommy. He hides when you look," he whispered, his voice quivering with an intensity that belied his age. A chill crept down my spine. I had heard similar stories before from other parents, dismissed as nightmares or the product of a child's active imagination. But something in Ben's tone, and in the way his eyes shone with a fearful certainty, made me pause. I slowly approached the closet, every instinct urging me to protect him, to banish this imaginary threat. I swung the door open, expecting to find nothing more than a jumble of clothes, stuffed animals, and perhaps a misplaced shoe. Inside, I saw only the ordinary. A few jackets hanging on a rod, a collection of Ben's old costumes, and a pile of neatly folded shirts. Nothing out of the ordinary. "See, baby, there's nothing here," I said gently, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. Ben's eyes, however, remained fixed on the dark recesses of the closet. I kissed his head, assuring him that I was there, that there was no need to worry, and carefully closed the door. I tucked him back in and turned off the light, hoping to smooth over the tremor in his voice with soft lullabies and whispered reassurances. The next morning, I went about the day as usual. I tried to push the incident aside as one of those fleeting childhood fears that would soon vanish. But as the day wore on, I couldn't help but wonder. At lunch, I found myself distracted, replaying the memory of Ben's terrified eyes and the soft insistence in his voice. I even tried to joke about it with a coworker, only to be met with a knowing look. I decided I'd keep an ear open tonight, if nothing else. That evening, after dinner and the usual bedtime routine, I tucked Ben in again. I left the door slightly open, thinking that the familiar dim light would dispel any lurking shadows. I lingered in the hallway for a few minutes, assuring myself that this was nothing more than a child's imagination. I returned to my room, determined not to let worry steal my sleep. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to a barely audible sound. A soft shuffling, like the rustle of fabric or the shifting of something in the shadows. My eyes, heavy with sleep, strained to adjust to the dark. At first, I thought it might be the wind or the settling of the house. But then I heard it again. A low, rhythmic creak coming from the direction of Ben's closet. At night, the situation worsened. I would lie awake, listening to the soft, deliberate sounds of someone moving around in Ben's room, as if the intruder was stalking his dreams. I began to see shadows in the corners of my own vision. The more I tried to rationalize, the deeper I sank into a vortex of fear and uncertainty. I even contemplated moving out of our home, but the thought of uprooting Ben, of breaking his sense of security, was unbearable. One night, as I sat in the darkened living room, a faint sound of scratching drifted from Ben's room, a persistent, almost rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to get up and approach his door. With a shaking hand, I pushed it open, half expecting to confront the monster. Instead, I found the room exactly as it had always been. Ben asleep, the closet door ajar. But as I moved closer, I noticed something that made my heart stop. A faint, almost imperceptible shape moving beneath the bed. I leaned down, and in that moment a low, raspy whisper echoed in my ear. "He's here." I jumped back, nearly tripping over a stray toy. Ben stirred in his sleep but did not wake. I stood frozen, listening to the silence that followed, the sound of my own heartbeat loud in my ears. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that our home had been invaded by something malevolent, something that defied explanation. Days turned into weeks, and the disturbances became a grim routine. Ben's fear was palpable. He clung to me every night, his eyes wide with terror, and I found myself dreading the darkness of our once safe home. I began to sleep with a light on in his room, but even then the nightmares visited. I would awaken, drenched in sweat, with the echo of that whispered warning reverberating in my mind. Desperate for answers, I installed more cameras around the house, particularly near his closet and under the bed. I scoured online forums and local news for any reports of similar hauntings or strange occurrences in our neighborhood. I even reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a reserved man with a calm demeanor who listened to my story with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He visited our home one evening, his equipment set up in Ben's room, and as the clock neared 3 a.m., he too heard the soft creaks and whispers. He left with a solemn nod and a cryptic remark. "There's an energy here that shouldn't be there. I'd advise caution." That night, I slept in a different room, too afraid to leave Ben's side. I kept the camera rolling, my eyes fixed on the monitor as shadows danced in the corners of the screen. In the dead of night, I heard it. A familiar, chilling whisper. "He's under the bed." I bolted upright, heart hammering, and rushed into Ben's room. The bed was empty. Ben was fast asleep, unaware. But the closet door was wide open, and the silence was oppressive. I reached out to shut the door, but before I could, the soft sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere behind me. I spun around, only to find nothing but the darkness of the corridor. I didn't sleep much that night. The terror had seeped into every corner of our lives, turning our once joyful home into a labyrinth of fear and shadows. Ben's eyes, once bright and curious, were now clouded with dread, and I felt a deep, unrelenting sorrow for the innocence he was losing. I wished I could protect him from this nightmare, but I felt powerless, trapped between rationality and the inexplicable terror that haunted our nights. As the weeks went by, I resolved to confront the situation head-on. I began leaving the closet door open during the day, shining a flashlight into its dark recesses, hoping that if the presence were real, it might retreat in the light. But every time, I found nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual clutter of clothes and toys. And yet, at night, the terror returned with renewed vigor, as if the darkness itself were a portal for something malevolent. One particularly cold evening, after putting Ben to bed and double-checking all the locks, I sat alone in the living room. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily as I sipped lukewarm tea, trying to steel myself against the dread that had become my constant companion. I thought about all the warnings I'd heard in hushed voices, all the stories of haunted children's rooms and unseen watchers. I wondered if I should believe that there was indeed a man, a presence, in Ben's closet. In that moment of quiet desperation, I realized I should have believed him from the start. I picked up the phone and dialed the paranormal investigator again, my voice trembling as I recounted the latest events. He promised to return soon, offering a glimmer of hope that perhaps we could uncover the truth behind the relentless terror. Until then, I knew I had to be vigilant. I would stay awake as much as possible, monitor every sound, and protect my son at all costs. That night, as the clock inched toward 3 a.m., I sat in the darkened hallway, the red glow of the camera's recording light the only companion. I listened intently. The silence was suddenly broken by a faint, deliberate rustling coming from Ben's room. I edged closer, every muscle tense. Then, unmistakably, I heard it. A low, sorrowful whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "He's watching. Always watching." The voice was barely audible, like a secret shared between shadows. I burst into Ben's room, determined to confront whatever it was. The closet door stood open, and the bed, which moments before had been undisturbed, now seemed to have shifted slightly, as though something had climbed out from beneath it. I knelt beside the bed, calling softly for Ben, but the child remained in a deep, troubled sleep, murmuring in his dreams. I gently patted his shoulder, then turned my attention to the closet. I reached inside, half expecting cold, clammy hands to brush against my skin. But there was nothing there, only darkness and the stale scent of old fabric. In that moment, I realized that the terror wasn't just in the physical space of the closet. It was in the unseen, in the way the night seemed to press in on us, in the persistent sense that something malevolent had taken up residence in our home. I held Ben close and whispered reassurances, though my own voice betrayed my fear. As dawn approached, I finally managed to coax a few hours of restless sleep. In the harsh light of morning, the room looked normal again. Ben was cheerful over breakfast, his earlier terror seemingly forgotten. But I knew better. I saved the night's footage from the camera, its grainy images a testament to the inexplicable events that had plagued us. I stared at the monitor in disbelief as I replayed the moment when the faint figure emerged from the darkness, its features blurred yet distinctly ominous. In the days that followed, I continued my search for answers. I scoured online forums, read books on paranormal activity, and even reached out to other parents who claimed similar experiences. I learned that I wasn't alone. There were countless stories of children witnessing entities in closets, of whispered voices in the dark, of a presence that watched and waited. The common thread was always the same, a deep, primal fear that no rational explanation could dispel. My nights became a vigil. I set up additional cameras, installed nightlights in strategic places, and even tried speaking aloud in Ben's room, hoping that acknowledging the presence might drive it away. Nothing worked. The phenomenon persisted, its intensity fluctuating like the ebb and flow of a tide. Some nights, the sounds were soft and almost mournful. Other nights, they were harsh and accusatory, as if the presence were growing bolder, more desperate. I began to wonder if the entity was bound to the space of the closet, or perhaps it was attracted to Ben's particular vulnerability. Every time he mentioned the man or the watcher, my heart sank, knowing that my son was living through a nightmare that I couldn't simply erase with words. I felt a profound guilt for dismissing his fears for so long, and I vowed that I would do everything in my power to protect him, even if that meant confronting something that defied all logic and reason. One evening, after a particularly distressing night, I found Ben sitting in his room, staring blankly at the closed closet door. I knelt beside him and asked softly, "Ben, can you tell me what you see when you look in there?" His eyes, large and solemn, met mine. "I see him," he whispered, barely audible. "He's always there, hiding, and sometimes he moves." I didn't know what to say. I could only hold him tightly, feeling the weight of his fear and the crushing responsibility to make it go away. That night, I stayed awake by his bed, watching over him as he slept fitfully, murmuring in his sleep. I promised myself that I would find a way to end this nightmare, whatever it took. Weeks later, the paranormal investigator returned for another visit. This time, he brought with him a few additional devices: an audio recorder, an electromagnetic field EMF meter, and even a thermal camera. He set everything up in Ben's room and in the hallway outside. As the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., we all sat in a tense silence, watching the monitors. Around 3:15 a.m., the EMF meter began to spike. The thermal camera captured fleeting images of a dark figure standing at the threshold of the closet. The investigator's eyes widened as he scribbled notes, murmuring, "This is beyond anything I've seen before." After the equipment was packed up, he looked at me gravely and said, "There's something here, something that doesn't belong. I can't explain it, but it's real, and it's affecting your son." His words hit me like a tidal wave of sorrow and determination. I knew then that I had to take drastic steps to reclaim our home, to rid it of this relentless intruder. I began researching rituals, cleansing ceremonies, and even sought out local spiritual leaders who claimed to have experience with such phenomena. I arranged for a small cleansing session in Ben's room, hoping that a blend of incense, prayer, and salt might drive away the presence. That night, as the incense smoke curled in the air and the leader intoned solemn prayers, I felt a brief moment of hope. For a few precious minutes, the atmosphere lightened. The oppressive weight of fear seemed to lift slightly. Ben slept more soundly, and I dared to believe that perhaps we had succeeded. But as the incense burned out and the night deepened once again, the old terror returned. The closet door creaked open. The familiar whisper of, "He's watching," filled the room, and I realized that nothing could banish something so deeply entrenched in our lives without facing it head-on. Now, as I sit here documenting every moment, I am left with more questions than answers. I should have believed Ben from the very beginning. His innocent warnings were not mere fantasies. They were the desperate cry of a child trying to make sense of an unimaginable horror. I have learned that sometimes the voices of the most vulnerable carry truths that the rational mind is too afraid to acknowledge. If you ever find yourself dismissing a child's fears, remember my story. Listen closely, look into the dark corners, and do not let skepticism blind you to the inexplicable. For in the quiet of the night, when the world sleeps and shadows come alive, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that lurk where we least expect them, inside the closets of our homes and the hearts of those we love. I continue to hope that one day we will rid ourselves of this haunting presence. Until then, I hold on to the promise that I will protect my son at all costs, even if it means confronting nightmares that defy logic. And as I write these words, the soft rustle from under the bed reminds me that our battle is far from over. I now know. I should have believed him, and I will never again dismiss a child's plea for help.